All right, we are back for part 2 of our chapter 13 lecture. So let's go ahead and just jump right in. So we talked a little bit about, as we kind of go backwards for a second, about how jails are revolving doors, right? We know that millions of people enter the system and millions are released only to be rearrested again, etc. And we call that recidivism. People kind of going through that process back and forth. So what now, or how would we consider, or what would we consider actually to be new generation jail? So to relieve overcrowding and improve effectiveness, a jail building boom has basically been underway. And many of the new jails are using modern designs to improve effectiveness. These are referred to as new generation jails, right? And traditional jails are constructed, basically on what is referred to as the kind of a linear intermittent surveillance model. Jails designed this way are somewhat rectangular with corridors leading to either single or multiple occupancy cells arranged at right angles to the corridor, if you will. And correctional officers must patrol to see into cells or housing areas. And when they are in a position to observe one cell, they cannot observe others, right? So it's kind of not a good system, the way that it's kind of laid out. Well, in contrast, these new generation jails allow for continuous observation of residents. And there are two types. There's direct supervision and indirect supervision jails. Direct supervision jails contain a cluster of cells surrounding a living area or a pod, which might contain tables, chairs, TVs, etc. And during the day, the inmates would stay in this particular day room, if you will. Okay? And a correctional officer is basically stationed within a pod. The officer has visual observation of inmates and maintains the ability to relate to them on a more personal level. And placing the officer in the pod increases the officer's awareness of behaviors and needs of the inmates as well. And this also results in a safer environment for both staff and inmates. And because interaction between inmates is consistently and closely monitored, dissensions can be quickly kind of detected before it really escalates. Okay, so that kind of makes it a little bit better. And again, during the day, inmates stay in the open area, the day room, and typically are not permitted to go back into their rooms except with permission from the officer in charge, right? So that kind of makes sense. And it might look like something like this, where you have the, corrections officer here, in the pod, if you will, and then you have the day break area here. And this is where people congregate pretty much all day, and at nighttime, then they'll go back to their particular cell. So that's kind of one look. And here's another example of a more secure pod type situation where you can see here's the pod with the officers being inside here, and they can look out here into the day room type area. And then going back, an indirect supervision jail uses similar construction. However, the correctional officer station is located inside of a secure room. Microphones and speakers inside the living unit permit the officer to hear and communicate with the inmates. So when we go back to the photos, this would be more of the new generation kind of direct, right? The pod is here, even though this is raised a little bit. The pod is within the same area here. They can directly communicate with the inmates, etc. Here would be more of the indirect, where the officer is secured inside of the pod, but there still is the day area out there. So you can see kind of the difference there. All right. and they're talking to the individuals through microphones, etc. Now, some critics suggest that new generation jails have basically failed to live up to their promise because they lack important components such as kind of normalized living environments in their facilities, etc. But safety is really a big deal. Okay, so that's a little bit about jails. Now, what about prisons? Well, there are about 1,800 secure public and private adult correctional facilities housing more than 1.5 million state and federal prisoners. And typically, there are three classifications of prisons. There's a maximum security prison, which kind of has a subcategory, supermax, okay? There's medium security prisons, and then there are minimum security prisons. And we'll kind of take a walk through each one. So, maximum security prisons are probably the incarceration institutions that, are most familiar with the public, right? Famous max prisons have included prisons like Sing Sing or Joliet or Attica or Walpole. And in the most fearsome prison of all, the now closed down federal facility on Alcatraz Island known as the Rock. So a typical maximum security prison facility is kind of a fortress-like, right? Surrounded by stone walls with guard towers at strategic places. The walls may be up to 25 feet high, and sometimes, inner and outer walls divide the prison into courtyards. Barbed wire or electrified fences are used to discourage escapes, etc. High security, armed guards, and stone walls give the inmate basically the sense that the facility is impregnable, meaning they can't get out, and realize or reassure the citizens outside that the inmates will be completely incapacitated, right? And in these, of course, inmates live in interior metal barred cells that contain their own plumbing and, sanitary facilities and are locked securely by either a key or an electronic device. And cells are a lot of times organized in sections called blocks. And in large prisons, a number of cell blocks make up a wing. So again, maximum security prisons, they house the dangerous felons, maintain strict security measures, high walls, limited contact. Security is the key. Prisons are, designed to eliminate hidden corners where people can congregate, etc. So, there's a lot to go into a max prison. So basically, again, kind of the word for maximum security prison is security. Correctional workers are made aware that each inmate may be a dangerous criminal or a violent criminal, that as a result, the utmost security must be maintained. And these prisons are designed to eliminate, again, those hidden corners where people can congregate, etc. So those are maximum security. Then kind of a subcategory would be the supermax. So some states have constructed super maximum security prisons, okay, to house the most predatory criminals. These high security institutions can be independent correctional centers or locked wings of existing prisons. Some supermax prisons lock inmates in their cells 22 to 24 hours a day, never allowing them out unless they're shackled. The supermax model is based on the assumption that prison disorder is primarily the result of a handful of disruptive, violent inmates, and that if these few can be basically controlled, the violence level in the entire facility can be reduced. So that's typically what a maximum security prison is. And here is the 8X Florence maximum security prison in Florence, Colorado. It's the only supermax prison in the U.S., and it is mainly home to terrorists, double agents, organized crime figures, etc. Inmates in this prison spend 23 hours in their cells. All windows face the sky, so no prisoners can orient themselves within the prison. So kind of an interesting thing, right? And a little bit more on this particular prison. It has one of the most sophisticated security measures, including 168 video cameras, 1,400 electronically controlled gates. Inside the cells, all furniture is not movable, unmovable. The desk, bed, and TV stand are made of cement. All potential weapons, including soap dishes, toilet seats, toilet handles, have been removed. The cement walls are 5,000-pound quality, and steel bars crisscross every 8 inches inside the walls. Cells are aligned so that inmates can see neither each other or the outside. So, are they effective? More than likely they are. Could there be some psychological issues? Yeah, I'd probably say there could be, but this is a supermax. So, kind of interesting. All right, next would be a medium security prison. So, although medium security prisons are similar in appearance to maximum security prisons, the security is not so tight or the atmosphere so tense. Medium security prisons are, also surrounded by walls, but there may be fewer guard towers or other security precautions. Visitation with personal contact may be allowed. Although most prisoners are housed in cells, individual honor rooms in medium security prisons are used to reward those who make exemplary rehabilitative efforts. Finally, medium security prisons promote greater treatment efforts, and the more relaxed atmosphere allows for more freedom of movement for rehabilitative efforts, rehabilitation workers, and other therapeutic personnel. So again, a less secure institution, typically houses nonviolent offenders, provides more opportunities for contact with the outside world, promotes greater treatment efforts, fewer guard towers, security precautions, etc. And then finally, you have a minimum security prison. So this is the least secure correctional institution, which houses basically white-collar crime, non-violent offenders, property type criminals, maintains few security measures, has a very liberal furlough and visitation policy. Inmates are allowed a great deal of personal freedom, but they are criticized a little bit that they're more like country clubs. Kind of like, there's a nickname for some of them. Minimum security prisons, again, have been criticized for being like country clubs. And at one time, some federal facilities even had tennis courts and pools, right? And people called these prisons, if you will, Club Fed instead of Club Med. Yet they remain prisons. So we have these 3 different levels of prisons. All right, what are some alternatives? So in addition to prisons and jails, a number of other correctional institutions operate within the United States, and some have been in use for quite some time, whereas others have been developed in more recent years, right? Part of innovative or even experimental programs. So, prison farms and camps. So another correctional innovation that gained popularity in the, from the early 1900s through the 1990s are what we call boot camps. Found primarily in the South and West, been in operation since the 19th century. Boot camps are short-term, kind of militaristic correctional facilities where inmates undergo intensive physical conditioning and discipline. The concept here is that short periods, 90 to 180 days of high-intensity exercise, will kind of shock that inmate into going straight. Could be because of the rigors and the schedules that kind of keep people on track. A lot of people need a schedule, and this is one place where individuals might get it. Next, we would have what they call shock incarceration in boot camps. Again, this is a term for a short correctional program based on a boot camp approach that makes use of military-like regimen of high-intensity physical training. So they have these prison farms and camps, and then this thing called shock incarceration. Again, a short correctional program based on this boot camp style of physical activity. We have community correctional facilities. Remember, one goal of correctional treatment is to help reintegrate an offender into society. And placing officers in prison makes them more likely to adopt a kind of an innate lifestyle. As a result, the community treatment concept began to take off in the 1990s. And a community-based correctional facility is one that houses inmates before their outright release so that they can kind of get acclimated to conventional society. Almost like a halfway house, if you will. So basically, they'll get out of prison, they'll go into this halfway house. And again, this is where inmates are transferred to just before their release into the community. So they're still under supervision, but they're getting ready to kind of go out on their own a little bit. So that kind of helps them along a little bit. Private prisons. So today, around 400 correctional facilities are being run by private groups as business enterprises, housing over 130,000 inmates. In all, about 19% of federal prisons and about 8% of state prisons are housed in private facilities. So, and there's a lot of controversy on whether private prisons are actually a good thing, especially when you're going to run something possibly for profit, right? So we just, kind of keep that in mind, but I just want you to know that there are private prisons. Okay, well, what about inmate populations? We've talked about different types of prison systems and some alternatives to correctional institutions, but what about the actual individuals? So the backgrounds and characteristics of inmates reflect arrest data and are similar to those of the jail population. Disproportionately young, male, minority, and poor. Compared to the estimated numbers of Black, white, and Hispanic males in the U.S. resident population, Black males were 6 times as likely and Hispanic males twice as likely as white males to be held in custody. And women still make up less than 10% of the total prison population. Now, many inmates suffer from multiple social problems. Okay, inmates are, undereducated sometimes, unemployed, come from abusive homes, and a disproportionate number have experienced homelessness, and associated social problems, including mental illness, substance abuse, and unemployment. And only about 1/3 of current inmates have a high school diploma, compared with more than 80% of the general population. So, when you talk about numbers, it's not surprising then that surveys show that inmates suffer from serious psychological and emotional problems, including psychosis and depression. These problems have kind of helped keep recidivism rates high. Remember the reoffending. And correctional officials have been searching for answers to this particular ongoing problem. So, and we also know that, budget cutbacks have kind of halted the expansion of prison construction and caused, the housing of even more prisoners in already crowded prison facilities. So when we're talking about population trends, we have to kind of consider that. And we know that California, right, has the early prisoner release in order to get the prison population down because it's really been so high over all of these years. And I gave you another link again to the website Statista, so you could look at prisoners in the United States, and you can look at it by gender, you can look by race, and it's very informative. So let's talk a little bit more about some of the population trends, and then we'll kind of finish up with leaving prison. So there are now indications that after decades of growth, the prison population may be on the decline. The crime rate drop in some states, coupled with alternatives to incarceration, have cut or basically at least stabilized the prison population. Convicted criminals are receiving shorter prison sentences than they were several years ago. And in addition, some basically, distinguished crime policy experts have suggested that incarceration is not always an effective crime control method. Instead, it might be more cost effective to shift from a reliance on a punishment-based policy to a more effective use of, police to make the risks of crime clearer and the consequences of criminal activity more certain. And, as a result of these trends and policy shifts, the growth in the prison population has finally begun to trend a little bit downward. And we can kind of go back to our chart here where we're starting to see just a little bit of a downward trend, right? Now, with virtually every state facing huge deficits, especially now with COVID and all this other things going on, many have begun cutting prison budgets and even closing institutions, especially prison camps and minimum security prisons, to help balance the budget. And some people agree with that, and of course some people do not. In the past few years, nearly half of the states have closed prisons, reduced the number of prison beds, or both. And states that have closed or considered closing the most prisons included Florida, New York, and North Carolina. Now, remember, California's realignment initiative, which basically shifted responsibility for a large number of inmates from the state to the county level, reduced the number of inmates by about 30,000, and actually it's been quite a bit more than that. And by all accounts, this trend is going to continue elsewhere throughout the United States. So in the kind of final analysis, if you will, the change in the correctional population may depend on the faith that judges and legislators place in incarceration as a crime control policy, right? So that kind of makes sense a little bit, right? On how we kind of use that. And I wanted to kind of end the lecture talking a little bit about leaving prison, because when you're going to get out of prison, you're going to be paroled, all right? And I want you to know the difference between probation and parole. And we've learned this in other lectures, but I want to make sure that it's clearly defined. Parole is the early release of a prisoner from imprisonment, subject to conditions set by correctional authorities. So for parole, if you look at the chart, you've been arrested, you've been convicted, you went to prison, you served some time, you're out on parole, and then if you make it through parole, your sentence is done. Probation is you're arrested, it's a conviction, but instead of going here to prison, you're going to get probation in lieu of prison. And there, as we've learned, there are terms for probation. And if you don't abide by the terms, then you could be sent back to prison, or you could get your prison sentence, right? And they could convict you. Well, you've already been convicted, so you could actually serve your sentence. But if you complete your probation, then your sentence is complete. So just know that usually when you're talking about prisons and leaving prison, it's going to be a parole issue, not a probation thing. So again, parole, a supervised program. It applies only in felony cases where a person is sent to state prison. Does not take effect until after the person's release. Once paroled, okay, the inmate agrees to abide by certain terms and conditions, and when an inmate is paroled, it depends on his or her sentence. So how do they get parole? Well, basically it's through a parole board. And the parole board's primary function is to select and place prisoners on parole, aid and supervise and provide continuing control of parolees, determine when the parole function is completed, and to discharge a parolee, meaning take them off parole, and determine whether parole should be revoked if some type of violation occurs. So that's the job of the parole board. Part of that release is going to be based on a hearing that they call a parole hearing. In the hearing, they review the cases, okay? And the cases differ depending upon the jurisdictions. Factors that are considered are the inmate's crime, their institutional record, meaning how have they been doing while they're, in custody, right? Their willingness to accept responsibility. And, the inmates' rights vary across jurisdiction. There's no federal right to legal representation, so you don't get an attorney. And the exclusionary rule doesn't apply at these different parole hearings, right? So even Charles Manson got to go to parole hearings, okay, even though he was the criminal that he was. And then finally, when we talk about, because we're talking about jails, prisons, and release, and even alternatives to correctional institutions, would be the problems affiliated with reentry, okay? And some of the problems are the prison experience, right? I mean, just merely being in prison makes it really difficult for an individual to come out of prison and do well. Supervision on the outside, personal deficits, economic deficits, employment, marriage and family deficits, community deficits, all of this stuff. So a lot of departments have basically, come up with what they call reentry programs. When I was chief at Rialto, we had the Rialto reentry program, and you can watch a little video on our reentry program right here. Now, I'm not there anymore, but the program still exists, and it's to help individuals that come out of the prison system to become successful, provide them with things that they need, right? The risks of reentry, inadequate treatment, lack of savings, lack of employment. Women face other special challenges, and the effect on communities. So here's kind of a part of a newsletter from our reentry program. And we would hold what we call resource events. And basically, they're free, and we would have the County of San Bernardino workforce development, places, educational programs, behavioral health, vocational training, faith-based, alcohol and drug counseling, tattoo removal, and a bunch of other things. How to get your driver's license. All of these things were there at these reentry locations, right? So these are all things that really try to help those individuals come out of the system and hopefully become more successful as they reintegrate themselves into society. So with that being said, that's going to conclude our lecture for this week. So remember, this is part 2 of chapter 13, talking about corrections, the history, different types of institutions, and population. So that'll conclude part 2.